When we think about the battles of the American Revolution, we often imagine lines of patriots and redcoats firing volleys at one another at close range, standing firm as ball and shot whirl through the air, striking friend and foe alike. The Continental Army, while also engaging in conventional line-based warfare, displayed also a unique willingness to adopt unconventional tactics. Using elite sharpshooters, they targeted British supply lines and harassed patrols, disrupting their enemies' supply and communication lines. But how did these tactics emerge? Who developed them, and why? These hit-and-run style tactics were the brainchild of Brigadier General Daniel Morgan, a rugged frontiersman, a drunk, and the greatest tactical innovator of the war on either side. Welcome to America's Forgotten Founders, where we will look at people whose contributions to the American Revolution, whether on the battlefield, in the halls of power, or on the home front, have been all but forgotten by the annals of history. Morgan never liked to talk about his childhood, so we're left piecing together fragmentary evidence. He was born in either 1735 or 1736, as the fifth child to Welsh immigrants James and Eleanor Lloyd. The modern consensus is that he was likely born in New Jersey, though both Pennsylvania and Virginia have claimed he was born in their state. We know nothing about his formative years, except that his childhood was harsh. After a fight with his father, Daniel left home at 16 or 17, traveling and working odd jobs throughout Pennsylvania and Virginia before eventually ending up on the frontier. Work was easy to find for the physically fit, hard-working, 6-foot-tall Morgan. On the Virginia frontier, Morgan helped clear land, worked as the superintendent of a sawmill, and pulled wagons as a teamster, a person who drove a team of draft animals. He was the epitome of a true American frontiersman, uneducated yet resourceful, with a hardened exterior and a notorious penchant for alcohol, gambling, and fighting. He loved to fight, going to court several times over drunken quarrels. When the French invaded the Ohio country in 1754, the lieutenant governor of Virginia, Robert Dinwiddie, appealed for experienced teamsters to help transport supplies for General Edward Braddock's army. Lured by the promise of good pay and adventure, Morgan joined the service in 1755. He excelled at his task until a British lieutenant, annoyed with Morgan's rude behavior, smacked him with the flat side of a sword. Being the rough, brusque man he was, Morgan would not let that slide. He punched and knocked out the British soldier. For this insubordination, he was sentenced to receive 500 lashes, a punishment that should have been a death sentence. Morgan would, however, survive his ordeal until the day he died. He insisted the British miscounted, and he only received 499 lashes. This event also left a deep and lasting impression on Morgan. He was appalled at the harshness of the punishment and the disrespect shown by the British towards their colonial subjects. The professional British troops often looked down on the uncivilized nature of the teamsters who were accompanying the army. Something else that stuck with him was Braddock's defeat at the Battle of the Monongahela. The French and their Indian allies attacked the British from concealed positions in the woods. The British attempted to form lines on the road. It was a slaughter. Over 450 British and colonial forces were killed. Another 450 were wounded. The French and their allies had 39 killed and 57 wounded. Morgan would remember this battle when New World fighting methods prevailed over those of the old. Continuing his service under then-Colonel George Washington, in April 1756, Morgan was shot in the back of the neck by an Indian scout when the supply train he was leading was ambushed. The bullet knocked out several teeth on the left side of his mouth and exited through his cheek. If he could survive 499 lashes, then getting shot once in the face wouldn't stop him. Morgan escaped the ambush and survived the war. After serving in the war and returning to Virginia, he purchased a 255-acre farm between Winchester and Battletown, Virginia. Around this time, he also met and may have married Abigail Curry. I say may have married because there's no official record of the two tying the knot. Nonetheless, it was not uncommon for unmarried couples to live together on the Virginia frontier. Regardless of their marital status, they were devoted to one another. The two would go on to have two daughters, Nancy and Betsy. Abigail, the pious daughter of a wealthy Virginia farmer, would go on to teach Daniel how to read and write. To some degree, Morgan adopted her religious beliefs. These newfound beliefs somewhat tempered his roguish ways, though not enough to stop him from getting in fights at the tavern. By 1774, their farm was relatively prosperous, so much so the couple owned 10 slaves. Owning 10 slaves was rare for a yeoman farmer. That year, Morgan also served in Dunmore's War, a series of skirmishes between the Shawnee Indians and Virginia militia in the Ohio River Valley. These skirmishes gave Daniel valuable experience in low-intensity woodland combat. When the Revolutionary War began, the Continental Congress asked the states to raise troops to serve the cause. Virginia answered the call, agreeing to send 2 companies. One of them was led by then-Captain Daniel Morgan, who recruited a company of 96 hardened frontiersmen before setting off to Boston. His battle-tested men had honed their skills in countless skirmishes against Indian raiders. While most of the Continental Army may have been green, Morgan's men were no recruits. This unit soon earned the nickname Morgan's Rifleman due to their remarkable accuracy and skill. His men's Kentucky long rifle had rifling, spiraled grooves in the barrel. This rifling gave their weapon far greater accuracy than the typical smoothbore musket. His men could hit targets up to 300 yards away. The average musket, by comparison, was effective up to just 80 yards. With their unparalleled accuracy, Morgan ordered his men to target British officers and Indian scouts. This decision outraged not only the British, but also George Washington, who ordered Morgan to stop targeting British officers. While his tactics might have been controversial, they were undoubtedly effective. Without officers, soldiers lacked direction. Without scouts, units couldn't effectively navigate. Being one of the 3 companies from Washington's army chosen by lottery to accompany Colonel Benedict Arnold's invasion of Canada in June 1775, Morgan and his unit fought in the Battle of Quebec in December 1775. Although his unit of frontiersmen managed to penetrate the outer ramparts and advance into the city, his men were still outnumbered, cut off, and surrounded. Morgan was now commanding the entire assault force. His 2 superiors, Brigadier General Richard Montgomery and Colonel Arnold, were killed and wounded respectively. Morgan was forced to surrender to the overwhelming British and French forces. He remained in captivity until being exchanged in a prisoner swap between the 2 sides in January 1777. Upon his return, he was promoted to colonel for his exemplary leadership during the Battle of Quebec. This greatly surprised Morgan, who, having surrendered, thought he'd never hold command again. While temporarily given command of the 11th Virginia Regiment, he soon received orders to form the Provisional Rifle Corps, an elite skirmisher unit comprised of 500 frontiersmen from Pennsylvania, Virginia, and Maryland. With this new rifle corps, Morgan adopted the same strategy he had with his company of 96. They used hit-and-run tactics, they harassed patrols, and they sniped at British officers. This unit terrorized the British in New York and New Jersey in mid-1777. At the same time Morgan was rampaging through the backcountry of New Jersey, General Horatio Gates was preparing to face General John Burgoyne's forces after the fall of Fort Ticonderoga. He wrote to Washington imploring for more troops. Whatever his misgivings about Morgan's tactics, Washington nonetheless recognized their effectiveness as well as Morgan's leadership abilities. His order for Morgan to immediately reinforce Gates showcases Washington's faith in the unit and their commander. The approach of the enemy in that quarter has made a further reinforcement necessary, and I know of no corps so likely to check their progress in proportion to its number as that under your command. I have great dependence on you, your officers and men, and I am persuaded you will do honor to yourselves and essential service to your country. I am, sir, your most obedient servant, George Washington. The Provisional Rifle Corps set off immediately, harassing the forces of Colonel William Howe, the commander of the British troops in New Jersey, along the way. When the First Battle of Saratoga finally kicked off on September 19, 1777, Morgan's men opened the first engagement during a reconnaissance and force operation, engaging a British column and killing many of its officers. A British soldier would later recount the opening action in his memoir. In this battle, an unusual number of officers fell. 3 subalterns, officers of the 20th Regiment on this occasion, the oldest of whom did not exceed the age of 17 years, were buried together. After initially charging the stunned lead column, Morgan's unit quickly retreated into the woods as British reinforcements arrived. During a lull in the battle, his men continued picking off British officers and artillerymen. Over 75% of British artillery personnel in the advance force were killed or wounded. After successfully withdrawing from the field, it would be 18 days before the forces again clashed. During this interim, Morgan and his sharpshooters constantly harassed Burgoyne's scouts, foragers, and patrols, keeping the pressure on the British and Hessian forces. During the Second Battle of Saratoga, Morgan's troops deflected the skirmishing attacks by the British's Canadian and Indian allies and directly engaged General Simon Fraser's regulars. While trying to rally British forces, General Fraser was killed. While some claim it was the work of Timothy Murphy, one of Morgan's best sharpshooters, this appears to be an after-the-fact fabrication. According to the historian John Luzader in Saratoga, A Military History of the Decisive Campaign of the American Revolution, Murphy likely wasn't even at the battle. Nonetheless, it's still likely that Fraser was hit by one of Morgan's men. They also attempted to kill General Burgoyne, and they got close. The general had a shot pass through his hat and coat. His horse was also hit. After the Second Saratoga battle, Morgan and his men moved behind enemy lines, routing any scouts sent north for the next 10 days. Due to their actions, Burgoyne believed his line of retreat had been cut off, so he surrendered on October 17, 1777. After the Saratoga campaign, Morgan and his corps rejoined Washington's army. Throughout 1778, he and his elite unit again raised hell in the countryside, raiding British supply trains and harassing patrols. Throughout this year, however, Morgan grew more and more frustrated. He had continuously been passed over for promotion to brigadier general, primarily because he was apolitical and did not bother lobbying members of Congress for a promotion. Several less experienced but politically well-connected officers received the promotion while Morgan remained a colonel. While privately acknowledging Morgan's instrumental role in the campaign, Gates, a self-aggrandizer, took all the credit. These machinations and debilitating back pain, a byproduct of his lashing during the French and Indian War, caused him to resign from the Continental Army on June 30th, 1779. He spent the next year helping his Abigail manage the farm. He refused to rejoin the army despite being repeatedly asked to do so. Without their leader, his troops joined General John Sullivan's 1779 expedition against the British-aligned Iroquois. Modern historians consider this expedition to be a genocide. After General Gates's nightmarish defeat at Camden in August 1780, Morgan, despite still being in poor health and bitter, put aside his misgivings and traveled to rejoin the Continental Army. As he was still unpaid, he took an extra horse with him to sell along the way. After arriving, he finally received his promotion to brigadier general on October 13, 1780. The new Southern Theater commander, Nathaniel Greene, gave Morgan command of a flying army to consist of infantry and horse. Morgan was to avoid pitched battle and instead harass the British wherever and whenever possible. Fighting in the rough, forested, and swampy South Carolina countryside, Morgan was in his element. Aware of Morgan's return, Lord Cornwallis sent the then Major Banastre Tarleton and his British Legion to hunt him down. Tarleton was much like Morgan. He was a hard-drinking gambler with a rough exterior. When the war broke out, he used his family's wealth to purchase an officer's commission. He soon, though, developed a reputation as a skillful and able commander, rising through the ranks. When he was made a major, he formed the British Legion. The Legion adopted much the same low-intensity tactics Morgan used. Tarleton was also infamous for his brutality. His unit had slaughtered Continental soldiers after they surrendered at the Battle of Waxhaws. In the ensuing cat-and-mouse game between Morgan and Tarleton, the former was outmaneuvered by the latter. Morgan ignored his orders and sought to fight a pitched battle rather than flee across the broad river. The subsequent Battle of Cowpens would be Morgan's most famous victory. Morgan walked amongst his troops the night before the battle, igniting their passion and courage for the fight ahead. Reportedly, he removed his jacket and revealed the scars etched into his back from that flogging all those years ago, imploring them to fight hard against the barbaric British. With Tarleton's already well-established reputation, it wasn't a hard sell. At the Battle of Cowpens, Morgan developed a battle plan that preyed on Tarleton's aggressive tactics. Much of Morgan's force was a colonial militia. Morgan knew the militia had a reputation for retreating from pitched battle, so did his adversary. Using this to his advantage, he decided to place his militia in the center of his line. The militiamen were ordered to stand their ground, fire 2 volleys, then feign retreat. The flanks were anchored by his sharpshooters and the Continental regulars he had on hand, waiting behind the crest of a hill. The militia would combine forces with the regulars and countercharge the advancing, disorganized British. After force marching through the night, the Legion arrived at first light. Tarleton, seeing the militia forming up, ordered an immediate assault. Skirmishers took their toll on the advancing British. The militia held their ground and fired 2 volleys. Several British officers were killed in this initial exchange. After the second volley, the militia, as planned, suddenly started to run. The British, seeing this, advanced on the routed colonists. The British forces began pursuing the fleeing enemy, losing unit cohesion and their combined firepower in the process. But when the militia reached the top of the hill, the militia and regulars formed ranks and, from 30 yards, fired a devastating volley right into the British forces. The colonists immediately countercharged. Stunned by the sudden reversal, the Legion, still weary from a long overnight march and ravenous from hunger, was shattered in an instant. Many simply collapsed to the ground, wounded or not. Others surrendered. Some rallied what little strength they had and tried to flee, but few would make it. Though Tarleton himself managed to escape, his prized unit, the best of Cornwallis's army, was effectively wiped out. 86% of the Legion was either killed, wounded, or captured. The victory changed the entire course of the Southern campaign. The British, without mobile troops, were greatly hampered in further operations, eventually forcing Cornwallis to withdraw to Yorktown and await reinforcements. But by this point, Morgan's sciatica was causing him immense pain, and he retired from the army. He briefly returned to active service, attempting to catch Tarleton in July 1781 in Virginia with the Marquis de Lafayette, but they would be unsuccessful. After his service, he'd invest all his money in land. Unlike Robert Morris, he'd be incredibly successful, accumulating an estate of more than 250,000 acres. He was a founding member of the Society of the Cincinnati, a fraternal organization of Revolutionary War officers. In 1790, Congress awarded him a gold medal for his victory at Cowpens. He briefly returned to the Army in 1794, commanding the troops that put down the Whiskey Rebellion. He served a single term in the House of Representatives for Virginia, serving from 1797 to 1799 as a Federalist. Daniel Morgan died on July 6, 1802, at his home in Winchester, Virginia, at the age of 65 or 67. Daniel Morgan was one of, if not the best, tactical commander of the war on either side. A rugged frontiersman who cared very little for conventional strategy, he sought to employ the irregular tactics he had learned from his adversaries during the French and Indian War. This he did to devastating effects. His tactics were highly controversial on both sides. Most thought them dishonorable. Nobody, however, could argue that they were not effective. An excellent military commander will often say that the ends justify the means. Victory at all costs. Morgan knew what worked, and he kept with it, honor be damned. The bitterness that drove him to resign from the army in 1779 also highlights the friction, factionalism, and politicization of the Revolution. His legacy inspired the character of Benjamin Martin, the woodland guerrilla who was the main protagonist of the movie The Patriot in the year 2000. In the end, the gruff, unrefined, and strong frontiersman in many ways embodied the battle between the ideas of the old world and the new, and what it really means to be an American. I hope you found this video both informative and exciting. Make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. And join us next time as we look at our next forgotten figure, the only woman to get a full pension for her service during the war in the Continental Army, Deborah Sampson.